Welcome, everyone. And Michael, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Rob.
Been a great admirer of yours for a long time.
Same here.
We're thrilled to have you here.
Yours.
So the one place you and I have in common in our backgrounds is we both went to Harvard Business School.
Right.
But it's really interesting. You and I have talked before. What made you decide to become an author? Because you became an author right after you left Harvard.
Right. I think the story may not be quite as exciting as it may sound like. You know, the only historian who went to Harvard Business School. It's like being the best restaurant in a hospital or something like that. My apologies to anyone who runs a hospital who's listening to us. I come from, as you know, outside of Chicago, born in Chicago and grew up outside of Chicago. And one of the big events of my childhood is, Rob, have you seen the Lincoln sites in Springfield in Illinois?
I actually, believe it or not, I have, yes.
I suspected that was true, particularly since you have a Midwestern background, but given your interest in history, I would have assumed that anyway. And I was taken there by my parents when I was about 7 years old, and that was a big event. And as I remember, I was there with my little brother, and we went to Lincoln's house, which I'm sure you've seen, 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, which is now much more accurately renovated than it was in those days. And as I remember, the guide was showing my little brother and me the chair that Lincoln sat in when he read to his sons. And Rob, I wish I could tell you that I asked, you know, what were Lincoln's views on civil liberties, or how was he as a military strategist, but I was 7 years old. So instead I asked something that was more pertinent to me at the time: when Lincoln's boys misbehaved, did he spank them? As I remember, the guide with sort of a disgusted look said, no, Lincoln never spanked those brats. Do you know that he let those brats run wild through this house? And I heard the guide say that, and Lincoln was the man for me. So I began reading everything I could about Lincoln and other presidents. So basically, I've wanted to write history books about presidents since I was, say, 7 to 10 years old. So to speed this up, as you were kind enough to mention, I was at Williams College up in Massachusetts under James McGregor Burns, who wrote, we were talking the other day, some in our audience will know this and have read the book. He wrote a book called Leadership, came out in 1978, Harper and Row, big book. He's the one who came up with the terms that probably most of us use: transforming leadership or transactional leadership. Those came from him and from that book. And actually, I was with him the night he figured those out. So in any case, he was my supervisor and my mentor at Williams. And I wanted to write history books. I didn't think I could teach history as well as I hoped to write it. So he said, well, what do you think you'll do if you're not going to teach? And I said, well, what do you think I should do? And he said, well, why don't you go to Harvard Business School, get an MBA, go on to get a PhD in history if you want, although it's not necessary if you're not going to teach, and then do something like work at a foundation, which will probably be very happy to have you write books. So that's what I did. And I went there in 1978, long before you were there. And my senior thesis, written under Jim's supervision, was a thesis on the relationship between Joe Kennedy Sr., the founder of the family, and Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
And so in any case, after I finished Williams, a publisher, Norton, expressed interest in publishing it, so I rewrote it. And the book came out about 2 minutes after I got out of Harvard Business School.
Wow.
In 1980. And it did well enough so that the foundation world was spared my full-time services, and I was hired instead by the Smithsonian as an historian. So loved Harvard Business School the second year. The first year I did okay, but you know, managerial economics, I learned a lot, but I'm not sure that my fellow students felt that I contributed all that much.
Yeah. And so you finished the first book, and then you went on to write a book about the U2 incident, which is a pretty fascinating incident.
Oh, thank you.
How do you find the ideas for your books? How do you do that?
Well, what I find maybe most exciting of all is two things. Number one, to write about a subject that you can still find new documents and still, turn up, new stories and new scenes, and in some cases, new people that others have not written about before. So you're kindly mentioning my second book, which was called Mayday, came out in 1986, which was on Dwight Eisenhower and the downing of this spy plane, the U-2, spring of 1960. So if you were in the Eisenhower Library about 2 years before that, 2 or 3, as I was, the most recent new documents that were open for any president would have been spring of 1960, Eisenhower, CIA, intelligence. So those had not been written about before by anyone. So it was like discovering a whole new world. But the other thing more important is I'm also interested above all in writing books that have some bearing, some way of illuminating the times that we're living in. So this was 1986. It was the depth of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev was just coming in, and there was a chance that Reagan might improve things. So the lesson of that book was, how can misunderstanding lead to almost a nuclear war, as it did in the spring of 1960? And as we later learned, it almost did in 1983 and 1984, when we now know the leaders of the Soviet Union mistakenly thought that Ronald Reagan might be aiming for a first strike attack on the Soviet Union, and that's why he was being so tough. And there were some moments during that period where the Soviets went on alert and had some things gone badly. I don't know if anyone has seen 7 Days in May or Failsafe or all those movies that came out in the early 1960s when people were worried about accidental nuclear war. It could have happened. It could have happened in recent years as well. On the beach, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, what is the process? I think people will find it interesting to know, what's the process of writing a book? And how long does a book, I know it varies, and you and I have talked before, it varies by type, but what's your life like as an author? How much of you're doing researching? How many hours a day are you writing? How much are you out marketing books? How does this work?
In my case, as we've talked about offline, I try to write in the mornings so that if things come up during the day or I get distracted, at least I've got some work done in the morning. And as Mark was kind enough to mention, I blab on NBC and PBS, and this year has been a disaster for everyone in all sorts of ways, horrible. But one way it's been different for me, I mean, aside from the important ways, this is a trivial way since you're asking about my daily life, is that you can go on TV fairly quickly from home. So if I were going on, let's say, NBC before, I live about 7 minutes in Washington from where the studio used to be. It's just moved to North Capitol Street on Capitol Hill. And I'd have to get into a car and then have someone make you up, and you'd go into a green room. And, usually you'd be glad to meet people there. Sometimes you'd run into someone that you'd been avoiding for a while in Washington, D.C. Not too often, but once in a while. So in any case, and that wound up taking maybe a minimum of 3 hours out of the day, even if it was going on just for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I can just be sitting here writing, and I can go on with about 3 minutes notice, same as I'm doing with you now. So it saves a lot of time, and it's made a little bit of a difference in my life. And the strange thing, for instance, I should mention, I'm sitting in my home office in Washington, D.C. Right. And, I've been sitting here for basically the last 20 years writing in this same spot, never expecting that this room would be seen by anyone outside my family and friends, especially because, and I apologize for the long answer, do you remember who Mike Deaver was?
Yep.
Mike Deaver, for those who are too young to know this or haven't studied it, was close aide to Ronald Reagan, was his communications person.
Yeah.
And so once, about 25 years ago, there was a picture of me that was taken inside our living room, And he said, you should never do that. You should never allow a photographer inside your house, never do TV from your house. It's too invasive. And that sounded sensible to me. So that is a rule I followed religiously until last March when all this began. So, I mean, life has changed in 9,000 ways that are much more important for everyone. But just since you're asking about my routine, that has changed things a little bit.
And so just to give people an idea, I know it can take you several years to write a book, depending on the topic and the research. The U2 book, for example, the second one you wrote, and the most recent one you're working on, I know how long did it take to write each of those?
Oh, the U2 book took about 2 or 3 years. And that was on a pretty precise subject.
Yeah.
It was about Eisenhower, and it was about the CIA, and it was about the downing of this plane. But the book I've just published, as you know, Presidents of War, covers over 200 years, and it's about 800 pages long. So that took about 11 years. And I'm now writing, as I mentioned, a book on race and the 20th century American presidents, which I've been working on for about 2 years. And as I was mentioning offline, one problem for people in my line of work, and I've talked about a lot with my friends who do this, is most of the presidential libraries and other archives have been closed for the last year.
Yeah.
And for people who are not in this business, you'd sort of think that by this late stage of technology, presidential libraries are online. They really are not. Some are. Kennedy Library is pretty good on that. Some of the others, Barack Obama Presidential Library is going to be totally online with no physical building for the first time in almost a century. But Bush Library, for instance, for people in Dallas, I'm sure most of you have been there. You know, they've been very good in opening things. But the point is that if you're dependent largely on presidential libraries, as I am, this has been no dice for most of this last year.
So let's talk about some things that you've learned, and let's start with presidential leadership. If you had to mention 2 or 3 key things you've learned that makes an effective president, what are some of the lessons you've learned in all the work that you've done?
Well, and I'm going to try to keep this brief because I know both of us would like people to come in with questions in a while. So
we're gonna pick this up in about 15 minutes to take questions.
Perfect. So I'll try to make this. And if I
ask.
go on too long, Rob, just
let's keep moving.
There's no hook, but you could just give me a signal.
All right.
Lesson number 1: you want to be a leader, be prepared to be unpopular, because you know, I was talking about Jim Burns, my old teacher. He taught me this when I was 18 years old. You want to be a manager, you know, nothing wrong with it, perfectly honorable, but managers, you know, keep the engine running. They don't change things. Leader of a country, leader of a company, leader of the Federal Reserve, they have a vision of the way things should be. It's going to involve change. It's going to make people unhappy. So there are a lot of people who love being popular. If you want to do that, you're never going to be a leader, because leadership will be agony. Lesson number 2, make sure you can explain unpopular decisions, because you don't want someone who's making unpopular decisions and then saying, all right, now, having done this, I will now resign because everyone hates me. I mean, the archetype is Abraham Lincoln, who in 1864, running for re-election, was able to explain why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which did the right thing, but wound up prolonging the Civil War, causing more deaths. A lot of people were unhappy. Lesson number 3 out of 4 or 5, just to keep this brief. Make sure your leader has a sense of history. I mean, beginning with the president, but I think this applies to every leader. How can you possibly become a leader of a country or of an organization or of a community if you have no idea what mistakes and what triumphs were true of the leaders and citizens who had gone before? I mean, especially if you're president of the United States, there's no manual. You are making 20 decisions, as Rob knows, at once. Oftentimes you're tired and confused. You don't have the kind of information a historian will have with almost 20/20 hindsight 40 years later. But what tool do you have? Sort of like I sometimes talk at commencements and I say, this is a slight overstatement, but not much. If you're not interested in history, fine. If you're not interested in history, your life experience will be limited to what happens to you and what your friends and family tell you. If you're interested in history and tap into it in some way, whether it's books, movies, or something else, you're tapping into the collective wisdom of billions of people who've walked the earth. If you're the new head of a company, why would you not want to know the history of your industry and your company and what worked and what did not? You know, you've got few enough roadmaps, that's one of them. So you want to be a leader, especially president. Harry Truman, for instance, from your home state or near your home state, could never understand, he said, I could never understand how you could have a leader or a president who had no interest in history. I've been saying that to groups for 30 years. Only during the last 5 years did I suddenly get shocked reactions from people that it seemed to apply to leaders of our own time.
So
that's how things have changed.
We often talk about the president, probably this happens with leaders generally, but particularly the president. You get isolated, you can get in a bubble, quote unquote. And we've noticed over the years, certain presidents have very strong teams and surround themselves with very strong people, and we've seen others that struggle to do that. What are some of your observations about that?
The best leaders is, and I know you agree with this because I've read you on this, the best leaders surround themselves with people who are more expert, in some case, smarter than they are. And you can say all things, and I would, all sorts of things against someone like Richard Nixon. But in many cases, Nixon had very great taste in people. I mean, you can disagree with what Henry Kissinger did. Richard Nixon would never have challenged the idea that Kissinger was smarter than he was and knew more about foreign policy. Not sure he was wiser than Nixon was, because Kissinger was skeptical that, for instance, you could have an opening with China that would work and might help to end the Vietnam War. But the other part of that, and I'd finish with this on just basic things about a leader. I was saying interest in history. That's something that's really ebbing in recent years. If you look at a lot of our leaders from both parties and in areas of American life, if someone says they're a great student of history, I don't think that gets them one vote. 100 years ago, it would have. 50 years ago, it would have. People recognize that that helped to equip you. The other thing that I think is diminishing as an attractive quality in electing leaders is, in fact, it's the opposite, ability to work with the other side. I mean, Mark was kind enough to mention these books I did on LBJ, who had many ups and many downs, but one thing he was able to do was, because he had been a leader of the Senate, he knew how to work with the other side, not to surrender his principles. Look what he did in the Great Society. And what I would consider to be the great mistakes he made in Vietnam. But this is someone who one of his closest friends was Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate. They went hunting together, they went fishing together, and he could make deals with Dirksen that did a lot for the country. Nowadays, many people would say, that shows that Johnson didn't feel strongly enough about his views or was ready to cave. I believe it goes back to the founders who wanted total political conflict. They'd love Congress nowadays. They'd love the conflict. But what we're missing is what they also wanted, which was compromise and negotiation.
So how has the presidency evolved over time? And related to that, we talk a lot about political polarization. Today, more, and people harken back to 30 years ago, it was more collaborative. How's the presidency and the demands on the presidency evolved?
I believe the presidency has gotten much too powerful, way beyond anything the founders ever imagined. If you think of the potential power that rests on the character and abilities and ideology of whoever becomes president, and I'm a registered independent, I'm coming at this without politics. Use of nuclear weapons, you have a president who's unbalanced, that person can launch a nuclear strike. That person has the ability to abuse the rule of law, the Department of Justice, our intelligence system. All sorts of powers of all sorts of other kinds that one day could be used by a president to undermine democracy. I don't believe that was ever the intention of the founders. They hoped that we would elect presidents of the character of George Washington, but someone like Alexander Hamilton specifically wrote about the danger that you might someday, this is my language, not his, I wish I could speak and write as well as Hamilton, someday there will be someone elected president who's not George Washington, and we'd better have the safety locks, this is me speaking, on our system of government to make sure that a president cannot cause too much trouble. My argument, and I wrote about this in Presidents of War, this was the theme of it, is for all sorts of reasons, we became okay in the last 80 years especially with giving presidents all sorts of power they never had before. It's probably okay most of the time, but it could be one day extremely dangerous, and we could come to rue that fact.
And the way it happened is out of crises, we ceded a little bit in extreme situations, and it never reverted back.
Bit by bit. Franklin Roosevelt said, or Abraham Lincoln said, I've got to take on almost dictatorial powers to carry out my oath to keep the Union together. So therefore, I'm going to suspend habeas corpus, and I'm going to shut down newspapers, and I'm going to do any other things, this is me speaking, not him, but this is what he would have thought, that I know are not what the founders intended, but unless I do these things, we're going to lose the whole country. And I do not intend these things to be a precedent for later presidents.
Right.
Then you get Franklin Roosevelt, whom I love 80% of the time, but Roosevelt in 1942 says, we've got to send people of Japanese descent to prison camps. I know that it's a violation of civil liberties, but we might lose the war. And I'm going to do other things that seem dictatorial, and I'm going to take on new powers for a president in wartime. And I don't intend these to be a precedent either. And by the way, Lincoln did it. And then you get to Richard Nixon in 1969 and 1970, who says, anti-war protesters are undermining our system of government. I've got to do something called the Houston Plan. I'm considering it seriously, which is abusing the FBI, break-ins into the psychiatrist's office of my political enemies, wiretapping of reporters. I have to do this as a matter of national security. All I'm telling you is one day we're going to be in a dictatorship, and if that happens, this is the way it's going to happen.
Okay. So much has been said. The country faces very tough problems. God knows government debt to GDP has continued to climb.
Correct.
We have a whole range of other issues. I won't get into how people, on that are being about certain groups that are not participating in capitalism.
Right.
There's the climate change debate, a whole range of other issues, very thorny problems. And we're struggling more than ever to find a consensus, it seems. Why are we having so much trouble? Why we've evolved to this point?
We're in a time when consensus seems like not a very good thing. And remember, I was saying it's the double legacy of our founders. The conflict side, they were basically saying, you want to be a good American, fight with people for your point of view.
Right.
Fight in Congress, debate it in public. Yep. And they said that because they were trying to devise a political system that was as little like the British system as possible.
Right.
How were the decisions made in England? The king or the queen made them. They did them in secret. You'd never see the documents. No one was allowed to question them, either at the time or later on. And the founders said, that's not the way to have a best society, because A, it's not fair to individuals who should have some influence over their destiny, and B, you get the best policy after argument. So as we were saying earlier, they'd love the conflict.
Yeah.
At the same time, they wanted Americans to be brought up by their parents and influenced by their friends and teachers to understand what democracy is, and to understand that we have certain rights under democracy, but also we have certain obligations.
Right.
And we have a right and an obligation to question authority and to fight with people and to argue and debate. But we also have a responsibility at some point to limit that and come back together at the end of the day. And we're now in an age of social media. The way you raise political money is not to say, you know, so-and-so and I disagree, but we're both patriots. It's to say, so-and-so is the devil and is destroying this country. And unless you send me $100 within the next 5 minutes, you know, the country is going down the drain.
Right.
That's the mode we're in right now.
So people have given, I'll throw out a few reasons. One, you just touched on money, and the outsized role of money contributions. Right. Gerrymandering has been another where you've got these changing in districts.
So few competitive districts.
It sort of creates partisan districts.
Correct.
And then the balkanization, or this, I guess the diffusion of the press and so many different press outlets. Right. And you mentioned social media. Is it all those things, or is it something about our leaders that are lacking?
I think that's all those things, and they foster a culture of argument and division. And for instance, you can reach, as you know very well, better than I do, extremely specific demographics.
Yeah.
If you are a libertarian vegetarian who's interested in Iceland, I guarantee you one day soon there will be a website for you, or maybe even a TV channel for you. 50 years ago, all those people were reading Life magazine, which had a circulation of maybe 30 or 40 million people.
Yeah, big.
If someone watched NBC Nightly News, that was an audience of maybe 20 or 30 million people. And the same thing went for CBS and ABC. And the 3 networks, and there were only 3, reached about 90% of the American people.
Yeah.
If President Kennedy in 1962 wanted to do a TV speech, it would be on all 3 networks, and he would reach 90% of TV viewers, and virtually everyone would see it. So if you were president, you wanted to reach Americans, you could do so very directly and very effectively. If your president wants to make a speech now, some channels will not carry it. You know, it's very easy to live in a cocoon where you can go through 4 years and never hear a speech by a president. So all I'm saying is we're all living in all these gated communities. They're getting smaller and smaller, more and more specific. We are living in geographical areas that are more and more homogeneous. That is continuing to happen. And you have access to all sorts of statistics that I don't, that I think would probably demonstrate that. Yeah. And so the result is, because of technology and because of the way this society is evolving, we're getting more and more and more divided and more in our little cocoons. And the onus is therefore put on a president and other national leaders and state leaders to remember that part of their job is not only getting elected and raising money and being popular, but also trying to bring the country together or bring the state together. You know, in the state, to remind everyone that there's certain interests that all of us have that may rise beyond your own personal selfish interest of the next 60 minutes. That's what leadership is.
So I'll ask you one more question before we go to the audience. You're an extremely accomplished historian. As you look at leaders today around the world, are there particular role models that resonate with you and you say, that person's a good role model for what we need today?
Individuals?
Yeah. There
wouldn't be any current ones because in my case, I basically only deal with dead people. and the reason for that is it's sort of the difference between looking at, you know, leaders as a voter, you know, I vote, so I've got to make decisions in real time, versus as a historian. And the idea of a historian is the difference is that you wait about 40 years or more because it takes that long to get all the documents out of a presidential library, or, you know, these tapes that I did these 2 books on, the LBJ tapes, he taped about 700 hours. So, you know,
are there leaders in history that if they were here today, you'd say, oh, thank goodness, we could really use so-and-so? Who would that be?
Well, you know, I would love to have Lincoln back. I love his empathy. I love his ability to defend unpopular decisions. I'm not sure how well he'd function in the world of 2021. So it's a little bit taking someone out of time.
Of course.
Franklin Roosevelt was a great war leader and a great leader of the time of the Great Depression, especially on issues that you are dealing with every hour of every day these days, Rob.
Yeah.
But if he had been president during the 1920s, a time that Americans were, they were very hostile to the Federal Reserve System, as I think you would agree, but they were very hostile to the idea that Washington should have, or even regional, philosopher kings and queens should have very much to do with monetary and economic policy. Roosevelt would have been very frustrated to have been president during a period like that, when they also felt that the US should not much be involved in the world. So what you need in the year of 2021, I would say, is someone who has what I would consider to be great values, who understands that a leader has to be unpopular, who can see the way the country can move for the betterment of all, but at the same time, is not living saying, gee, I wish it were 1900. It's not 1900, it's 2021. And people are very suspicious of leaders, and they're very resistant to what a leader says. You want someone who can make him or herself heard and felt above and beyond that din.
Got it. And be authentic and appear authentic, I imagine.
Because, lack of authenticity, Richard Nixon would not cut it in 2021. He had many other qualities. Authenticity was not one of them.
All right, let's go to the audience. Mark Wynn, let's take some questions.
Okay, so just a reminder, if you'd like to ask the speakers a live question, just click on the raise hand icon on the control bar to enter the queue. We have one question in the queue from Gordon Piper. Gordon, as soon as you're unmuted, feel free to ask your question. Gordon?
Can you hear us? I'll chime in for a second. I think he's still muted. The first time I was ever at lunch in the White House was when I was a young man and Ronald Reagan was president. And he got up to speak at the end of a lunch in the state dining room, which you all see all the time because especially during the pandemic, President Trump and President Biden have been using it a lot for meetings. And Reagan got up at the end of this lunch to speak, and he reached for his note cards, couldn't find them. And he said, if I don't find these note cards, the next 15 minutes are going to be very quiet. And he finally found them. And I was curious, to this day, the government printing office every year puts out a volume of everything the president has said in public, more or less, for the previous year. And so I quickly leafed to that day to see whether it had the joke about not finding his cards. It was not there. So presidents, even in this day, sometimes are able to clean things up.
Let's if we can't get Gordon, let's take another.
Right. And maybe we can come back to Gordon if it's a technological problem.
Gordon?
Or maybe later on if we can.
Okay. Well, let's
and by the way, if we need to fill in, Rob, if you if you or I just want to talk about it,
we're going to be fine.
We have plenty to talk about if not.
Keep going, Mark.
Next question is from Jason later. Jason, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks a lot. I was wondering if you see any similarities to the current time versus the 1960s, because there's very large increases in expenditures, both in nominal dollars and also as percentage GDP.
Correct.
Potential increases in taxes, which we also saw in the 60s.
Right.
And large and increasing deficits, as well as just the divisions in the country.
Yeah. Are you an economist, Jason?
No. Finance.
Okay, good. All right. Then I'll argue with you. I mean, if I'm arguing with economist, I'm way out of my league, but since we're both civilians. I'd argue with you a little bit about taxes in the 1960s. Johnson passed the Kennedy tax cut in December of 1963, and he did so just to keep Rob sitting in his chair comfortably in order to keep the federal budget against that horrifying number of $100 billion.
Although there was a 10% surtax.
That was in 1968, and it was forced on Johnson against his will. And Johnson's relationship with the Federal Reserve in the 1960s was not, I would not have wanted to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve or the job that Rob holds in the 1960s, because you had a president who looked at the Federal Reserve System and its leaders not as partners, but as obstacles. So
Right.
I would say, as an historian with 2020 hindsight, I wish someone could go back and order Johnson to accede to higher taxes in the 1960s to pay for both the war and also the Great Society. He didn't. And as a non-economist, I would say, and I hope I'm not too far wrong, Jason, that led to, in great measure, the ruinous inflation of the 1970s especially, and also that surcharge of 10% in, as you rightly said, that was forced down Johnson's throat during his last year, caused us to enjoy the last roughly balanced budget, I believe, until the mid-1990s. So, you know, if we're all pros here and you're asking me what's one quality I'd like to see in a president, it would be a president who understands the degree to which the chair of the Federal Reserve and the other leaders of the Federal Reserve System, like Rob, you know, they should never be in league or conspiracy with the president, but they should see themselves as at least people who are all at least on the side of American prosperity and world prosperity, even though they might have different roots to that. Lyndon, whom I love in his own way, he saw the chair of the Federal Reserve, who was William McChesney Martin, if I am not mistaken. He saw him as someone who had to basically be thwarted, and it was not for the good of the country.
All right, let's take more. Keep going, Mark.
Next question is from Tanvir Suri Tan. Tanvir, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. You can just call me Tan.
Okay, hi Tan.
Nice to meet you, and thank you for doing this. So one thing that you spoke about was kind of dealing. I liked what you said about Lincoln. Right now, when I look at our current political spectrum, this is the most fractured that's probably been in modern times.
Modern times.
And if I'm
with you.
But I was wondering, especially with your knowledge and your research, have you seen either the US or even another country deal with this level of fracture? How did they, not just solve it, but, move through it and kind of help get that unity back? Because right now, I can't remember the last time. It's literally 51% versus 49%.
Right. Yeah, it is very closely divided and very divided. Obviously, 1859 and 1860, the country was so fractured, we went to a civil war. We are not, thank God, anywhere near that point. And although we disagree about a lot of issues, the disagreement is not that fundamental and overwhelming as it was then. One parallel I think works to some extent for the time we're living in is early 1933. Banks were closed. Thank God we're not suffering from that now. High unemployment, people were starving, losing their houses. There was an awful lot of suffering. And basically, if I could go back through time and tell the president who was incoming, Franklin Roosevelt, what to do, it would be, you've got to relieve suffering fast, because if you do not, we could lose our democracy. If you do not show people that our free enterprise system works with some regulation and with some constraints, they are going to, and they would have every reason to turn to Huey Long, who wants to redistribute the wealth, or Father Coughlin, who is dictatorial, had a radio show every week from Royal Oak, Michigan, near Detroit, or other leaders that have voices that are pretty much outside the consensus. I don't think we're to that point yet, but we're in a divided country where I think if our system does not seem to work, especially in creating prosperity, which most of the people on this call have a lot more direct role in than I do or most Americans do, if it doesn't work, there are all sorts of groups right now in America who would love to come into the political system, especially in 2024, and go a route in some cases that we have not seen before.
So let me follow up on that, because you've touched on it. So we've been in the middle of, for lack of a word, a war against COVID for the last year. There's been a crisis.
Right.
We had wealth and income inequality going in, although some of it was closing, and it's gotten worse.
Yes.
So these groups you referred to have not done as well. As people with college education or greater, or with wealth. And I hope we're about to emerge eventually from the COVID crisis to a more peacetime. What kinds of advice would you give to the Federal Reserve and to leaders generally in the government about how we should make this transition? Some of the pitfalls, some of the things you've learned.
Yeah, I think the main thing is, and given my poor performance in economics at Williams College, I would not presume to address the Federal Reserve with anything even approaching a prescription. But just to underscore how much is at stake right now, and I'll speak very personally, in 2008, when the crash occurred, and this is actually a pro-Federal Reserve comment, but this is just history. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the least ideological people I think you probably have ever met. But when we suffered what we did with the Great Recession of 2008, I can remember talking to my wife, whom you know, and she's your great admirer as I am, and saying, if I were someone who was thrown out of work in one of these factories in the Midwest,
yep,
and I saw the CEOs even richer at the end,
yeah, and
something was not done to correct these problems pronto, just me, and I'm a fairly mild person, I would be irate and I'd be taking a torch through the streets. Yep. That's my direct quote from September 2008. Well, to some extent that has happened.
Yeah.
I would give the same message today. There are many Americans who have seen this last year. And why is there distrust of government? And this is not a political comment. Our government did a terrible job during the last year of confronting the crisis of COVID. Yeah. I like to think that we learn from history. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson, whom I love for what he did with the Federal Reserve System, as I would guess you probably agree with Rob, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but on that side, Wilson was a great leader, but he was the opposite of that on the influenza pandemic. 675,000 Americans were killed. 50 million people around the world were killed, largely because Woodrow Wilson was a very selfish man who said, I don't want to become unpopular, especially at time of World War I. So I'm not going to admit in public that there's a pandemic at all. I'm not going to tell anyone how to protect themselves. I'm not going to use the federal government. And Wilson was perfectly happy to take a lot of power for himself to fight the war, wasn't willing to do this to fight the pandemic. Yeah. A huge number of those 675,000 died. They did not need to die. So if you and I, Rob, were talking 2 years ago, I would have said, presidents will make many mistakes. They will never again make the mistake of Woodrow Wilson, which is refusing to use the presidential pulpit and the power of the federal government to do everything they could to carry out one of the most basic obligations of a president, which is to help people survive. And this is not a political comment, and this is true of all of our government.
Yep.
Our government failed us. So you've got people very angry, rightfully so, at the fact that they were not protected during the last year. Okay. They've seen, just as you've suggested, more inequality. People around the top have done great during the last year. The inequality has gotten worse. And all I'm saying is, and this is not a political comment because the prescription is not vote Republican or vote Democratic. It's find great leaders who can preserve our democracy. I'm a deeply conservative, institutional conservative. I want to see our democracy conserved. I want to see our rule of law conserved. I want to see our system survive. And democracy always requires eternal vigilance. So all I'm saying is there was a lot of anger that came out of 2008. There were too many people in the Midwest that showed in the 2016 election who were so angry because they felt that the solutions were unfair and they did not work. Right. All I'm saying is that the same thing could be true as a result of this horrible year that we've all gone through. horrible both in terms of
Yeah.
almost every family suffering, but also in terms of most people economically suffering. And if you've got a lot of Americans saying, once again, we've been ripped off and it went to the people at the top, I don't know how a democracy can survive. So all I'm saying to leaders is, if you're as institutionally conservative as I am, make sure in the year 2021, you give people the sense that the system works and it protects everyone. You want democracy? That's the way to do it, in my view.
Okay, very good. All right.
Okay, next up is Brad Elledge. Brad, go ahead and ask your question.
You just made an observation, Beschloss, about the power that we've ceded or has been accrued to the executive branch, and that it's grown and grown. And we're certainly seeing it with all the executive orders of the last two administrations. I mean, they are just fast and furious.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts on how we, like in a portfolio, you rebalance periodically, right? You move things around to make sure things are working in your portfolio. How do we do that politically?
Well, that is a total response to what's happening in Congress. If you think that the founders would come back and love what they've seen from Congress from the last 6 years and say this is a Congress that is very effectively dealing courageously with some of our basic problems, if a president felt that way, a president only does executive orders because they're put to their wits' end. And that happens among Republican presidents, it happens among Democratic presidents. If you could get Congress to become slightly functional, I guarantee you, as a law almost of physics, you'd see fewer executive orders. And executive orders in themselves are not a bad thing. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. All it is, taking something that the courts and the Congress agree are a power that's accorded to a president, putting it in writing and saying, this is what the president wants to see done. But I think all those executive orders, and I don't like to see so many either, I think that's just a symptom of, especially a system in Congress that's not working.
Next up is Rosie Stromberg. Rosie, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. On a lighter note, have you developed an interest yet in researching the roles of any of the first ladies in presidential decision-making?
Oh, huge.
Last several.
Oh, yeah, totally, because one thing I can tell you is true in just about every presidential administration. I have known every first lady back to Lady Bird Johnson, and I knew her extremely well. And this is true of her, it's true of most first ladies, and soon there will be a first gentleman, I presume. Hope it is soon. You'll always have the first spouse say, I had no influence, give all the credit to the president. And then when the documents come open and you begin to talk to their aides and the true story comes out in 30 or 40 years, you find that in most cases, these first ladies were enormously influential. To take the case of Lady Bird Johnson, whose first ladyship began in Dallas on that tragic day in November of 1963, she would and did. She lived until 2006. I talked to her many times. She'd always say, it was all Lyndon, I did my best to help. Well, I know that it was a lot more than that. She was kind enough to give me her diaries, and I also heard her on these tapes. And I would not say that she suggested to LBJ fine points of monetary policy, and good thing, because she didn't know much about it. And, like all of us, she knew her limits. But Lyndon Johnson was someone, I'm not psychiatrically trained, but who had enormous emotional and psychological ups and downs. She made it possible for him to function. She buffered his highs and buffered his lows. And someday I think there should be statues to her erected, because she made it possible for him to do some very good things in the 1960s and put some limits on him in making some mistakes that had to do with the Vietnam War during the same period of time. So even if you're only interested in male presidents, and I'm actually interested in first ladies as well, if you're trying to understand what caused them to do the things that they did. I mean, for instance, Mark was kind enough to mention a book that I did that came out 11 years ago, which was the reminiscences of Jackie Kennedy after her husband was murdered. She made these tapes with Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, that were supposed to be closed for 50 or 100 years, basically her memoirs of her husband's years as president and hers. And Caroline decided to bring them out in, I think 2011 it was, and so they came out. And anyone who listens to that and thinks that Jackie Kennedy was only dealing with the renovation of the White House would be badly misinformed.
Okay, very good. Let's take more.
Thank you, Rosie. Next up is Robert Clark. Robert, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, first of all, I have thoroughly enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating.
Wish we were all together.
You made a comment earlier about the understanding of the founders, that they operated with the assumption that people understood something about democracy, and they understood something about history, and they had values that they had gotten from parents and teachers and others who influenced them. Could you comment on how much you think the breakdown of the family structure and the educational system, eliminating any studies of civics or history or democracy, is having an effect on our society today? And what, if anything, we ought to be trying to do about it?
Yeah, I promise, Robert, you can confirm this. We have not orchestrated this in advance, but yes, I sure would agree with what you have said, because, you know, democracy, again, I don't want to speak for the founders, but one thing about being an historian is you can speak for people who are not here, and they're not here to say that I wouldn't have said that if I came back to life. So here we go. I think the founders would say that democracy in this country depends on having a pretty educated society, which they did. They could rely on that. People who were very well read, who understood that one of the obligations of citizenship is to think very carefully about issues and debate them, and to do that not in the heat of anger or momentary passions. We're not in those times anymore. And anyone who, as I am, and maybe Robert is unhappy about the fact that people don't seem to know what democracy is anymore. You know, these famous polls where someone will take the Bill of Rights and read it to someone on the street and say, would you support that? And they would say never. You know, I mean, the founders assumed that everyone would know, not necessarily to be able to recite the Bill of Rights, but they would know what was in it and know how important it is to protect it. So if you have citizens who don't know what it is, who don't know how important it is to guard, then why would we be surprised that democracy is more vulnerable than it may have been at earlier times? Think of Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 and 1941. American democracy was in danger from the Imperial Japanese, from the Italians, from the Nazis and others. And Roosevelt went on the radio and said, I won't do my bad Roosevelt imitation, never before since Jamestown or Plymouth Rock has our democracy been in such danger. Now, in 1940 or 41, he could assume that virtually everyone who listened to him would know what Jamestown was, what Plymouth Rock was, and what they meant in history. Now, you know, if I were writing a speech for a president, which God help that president, but if I were, I would never put references like that in a presidential speech, because, you know, most people don't even know what those things are. I mean, we're living in a different country, and it's a problem.
Let's take at least one more.
Thank you, Robert. Next question is from Rohit Milstein. Rohit, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. So, given the importance of knowing history, and I agree with you about that, could you comment on the use of textbooks versus primary sources in education? So, for example, if one reads the Articles of Secession from Mississippi and South Carolina and Texas, there's no question about where the Civil War came from.
Right.
But that's not what's in textbooks down here in
Right.
Texas.
Right. It's this is an argument. It's said that history is an argument without end. The same thing will be true of textbooks. Until the end of time, especially in the public schools, you will have arguments over which textbooks to use, which view of American society they suggest, whether there are sentences in those books that offend certain people, both of the left and the right. And we should have those kind of debates. But it's there are all sorts of benefits in having public schools that I don't need to list for anyone who's in on this Zoom call. But one thing that is difficult is that you have to achieve consensus on what kind of history you teach, because everyone is paying for it. And we are living, as Rob suggests, and I would totally agree with him, or I think he suggested, but I would suggest, in a time where consensus is very hard to find. All I can say to make all of us feel better, Rohit, is at least we're in a time where we have a free country and a First Amendment, and we can argue about the textbooks. And sometimes if a textbook is, too off base, you can raise that in public and maybe get it changed. That's the way our system is supposed to work. But if you're asking me would I prefer to have primary sources taught, absolutely, but you're still then depending on teachers to interpret those documents, and we may not like what they say.
So I guess I'm sensitive. The time as we'd expected has flown by, and we would love to talk for longer. But let me ask you a closing question. We've got a whole range of folks listening to this, either business leaders,
right,
civic leaders, parents, people. Obviously, the fact they're tuning in care about what's happening to the country and are interested in civic issues. What advice would you give each of the folks plugging in individually if they don't like what they see, or they want to make an improvement in their communities or in the world? What advice would you give them about what they can do to make a difference?
All of the founders. This is a bromide only because it's so true. Harry Truman said that the greatest title in the United States is not president but citizen, and he really meant it, because given the number of rights and responsibilities that all of us have as citizens, that is not a full-time job, but there are big obligations there. Go vote, learn about candidates, learn about the issues, reach outside your cocoon so that you're not just, watching a cable channel that affirms your own views, as I say, as one who appears on cable channels. Get as much information as possible. But at the same time, we have a political system which, in my view, gives too much power to leaders. It's probably a necessity of advanced technological society, but there it is. President is just one example of that. So if you're worried about democracy, if you're worried about our country surviving with the kind of values that you and your family love, make sure that you elect leaders who are effective and who share your values. I mean, when I got into this business 40 years ago, straight out of Harvard Business School, people would say, does it really matter who's elected president? Policy doesn't change very much, whoever is elected. That was 1981. Here we are 40 years later. I don't think people would say that nowadays. It matters a lot. Mattered just as much in 1981, but I think now everyone understands it. So all I'm saying is we're living in a culture that is very divided. The last election was decided by 55,000 votes in only a few states. Some of us are happy that it went one way, or might have been happier had it gone another way. But the point is that we're living in a country right now that is right on the knife edge. So anyone who would say, why participate in the process because it doesn't have much influence, what moment in history does an individual citizen have more influence just by voting for president, for instance? So all I'm saying is if you care about any of that, and if you'd like democracy to survive for your children. I've got two guys who are in their 20s. I think we will probably have a democracy for their lifetime, but I agree with the founders. Democracy is always in peril. And the best way you can deal with that is to make sure that all of us are, as citizens, choose great leaders and are always involved.
All right. Michael, I'm glad you chose to be a historian coming out of Harvard Business School.
Oh,
I think
thank
the
you.
country is we're all better off for it. And thank you.
I
for
say
all
the
that
same
do.
for you, Rob. Thank you
thank
for all
you.
you've contributed to your country.
All right. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you to
really
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Sorry
Thank
we're
you.
not together, and everyone stay well. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Apologies if you submitted a question that we did not get to. You'll soon receive a survey asking for feedback on this event, and we would very much welcome your candid responses. We hope you'll be able to join us for some of our upcoming Global Perspectives events in the next couple of months, which will feature Baker Ripley President and CEO Claudia Gear, Fort Worth Mayor Betsy Price, and former Xerox CEO Ursula Burns. Details on how to register for these events can be found at dallasfed.org. And with that, we are adjourned. Have a good evening.